Well, hello, and welcome to the editing room. I am AJ O'Neill, and you're watching a Beyond Code live mentorship session. This segment is broken out into multiple parts, playlist in the description, and the particular bit you're watching here is about block scope versus function scope. And although we're using this in JavaScript, how this applies to for and for each loops is fairly applicable across many different languages and something that you should be familiar with. In particular, this is really useful in modern compiled languages like Go and Rust. And if you think you've already got a good handle on that, just go ahead and check any of the timecode descriptions down in the doobly-doo and then head on to the next one. And here we go. So one thing I did want to mention before I continue with this though, is before I said in languages like JavaScript, there's no difference between putting the initializer above the loop and the initializer in the loop. It's not entirely true, but in most languages are what we call block scope languages, and JavaScript is a function scope language, which means that in many languages, if you did something like this, var I equals 0, the I would exist inside of the block, but we wouldn't be able to say console.log the block or the I down here. So I'm just going to do this for demonstration purposes before we move on. So if I run this program, notice that I exists outside of the loop. So it doesn't matter whether you declare something inside of a loop or outside of a loop, because JavaScript is a lot simpler than many other languages in that it only cares about function scope. That said, let was introduced to the language, and it's, in my estimation, this is a completely different language. There's basically a new language that is a superset of the old JavaScript, but it is not, from a technical perspective, if you were to say, are these two things the same? It's not like it's a minor improvement. It is a different language. Because you have to significantly change a language to make these types of changes. But let will not exist outside of a loop. And I don't believe that const will either. So this time we're going to get an error when we run this. Yeah. So it's saying there is no I here. And in a language like JavaScript, typically this kind of difference doesn't actually matter. But in languages like C, when you declare a variable, variables take up space on the computer. Pretty much an uncountable amount of space because they're so tiny, but when you have millions of them or billions of them, it becomes very countable very quickly. Or if you're using data that has millions of something, like a picture has millions of pixels. And so the reason for this, from a technical perspective, is that when you exit the loop, that memory no longer has to be used anymore. So in programs that are a different style of language than what JavaScript is, there actually is some real tangible benefit to this. And I think when they introduced let, I don't know that there's real tangible benefit to it, but it does allow people to use kind of semantics that they're familiar with in other languages. Does that make sense, or do you have any questions about what I was just describing?
I guess the only question I have is, so let, just to clarify, let allows it to only take place within the loop and not outside of it?
Within a block, more particularly.
Within a block.
So a block is wherever you see curly braces. So it's actually possible, this is something a little bit weird and slightly tangential, but I feel like this is worth clarifying, especially with the changes that have happened in JavaScript with loops and just discussing loops generally. This would be very, very bad, and I would never recommend someone do this, and I would chastise someone if they did do this. But you could get rid of these curly braces, and this should run. Let me see if it does. Indeed, it does. So let me change that let to var, and we can run this. So the loop runs. So a for actually operates on what is technically called a statement, which means one line of code. So technically I could do this right here, and this would mean that the loop would do nothing. So we can go out of here, and I can run this, and the loop does nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And then it prints after the loop is done, or rather, not the loop does nothing. The loop does loop 10 times, but it doesn't do anything during those loops because I've told it what you're supposed to do is nothing. By giving it a semicolon, it says, end of line, end of statement, nothing to do. And so this loop, in this case, will do nothing. And the danger is this. If I were to do this right here, this looks as though, visually, when you look at this, it looks as though the loop will do two things. In reality, the loop will only do one thing in its loop. So this check and last are no longer meaningful. Actually, I will go ahead and put this down here. So it looks like the loop would do these two things. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And we'll see the loop only does one statement. And then the next statement executes after the loop.
Mm-hmm.
So when you create a block is a feature of a language that can go in place of a statement. So inside of a block, I could do something like this. Let A equals ABC. And if I were to try to console.log A before the block, A does not exist. And if I were to console.log A after the block, A does not exist. So let can operate in what we call block scope. And this is pretty much in every language. You will occasionally, it is pretty rare to see this, but there are particular reasons that people do use block scope in this way. Particularly, there's a language called Rust, which is becoming more and more popular right now and is widely used in some of the top applications on the internet because of how performant it is. And it doesn't make any sense to do this sort of thing as far as I'm aware in JavaScript, because JavaScript is a garbage collected language. But in languages where you manually manage memory, doing something like this would make it so that you can do something with this variable A, and it will only take up space inside of the block. And when the block is over, the variable A will no longer exist and will be completely free from the computer's memory.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I mean by block scope. Is a statement is typically one line, and then it can be ended manually with a semicolon, or depending on the language, it can also be ended with a new line. A semicolon is explicit and will always guarantee the correct result. Using a new line, especially in JavaScript, can sometimes have unintended consequences, which is why you may have heard of people arguing about whether or not to use semicolons. From a technical perspective, you should. From a technical perspective, if you use semicolons, your code will always be correct, assuming that you wrote the code correctly, because you were explicitly telling the program, this is the end of the line, do not continue past the end of the line. But some people prefer to just know the rules because there's like 4 or 5 exceptions to when that is true versus isn't true. And so some people just prefer to memorize those 4 or 5 rules, and then they know when they have to use a semicolon and otherwise they don't. I am the type of person that I prefer, let's memorize as few rules as possible. Let's do the thing that always works in every situation, rather the thing that sometimes or most of the time works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So anyway, I want to get us back to what we were going to do with the loop. But now if I put this block here, the block ensures that everything between the curly braces is going to be evaluated for each iteration of the loop rather than only the next statement. Because the block says, rather than reading just one statement, read every statement until the end of the block.
Right.
And you can nest blocks So I could do something like this. This is going to look silly, and it is very much indeed silly, but this is valid to do. It doesn't mean that you should do it, but it is valid to do something like this. Because this just says, this statement doesn't end until the matching brace. And then it opens and it says, this statement doesn't end until the matching brace. This statement doesn't end until the matching brace. This statement doesn't end until the matching brace. Here's a statement, semicolon, here's the end. Matching brace, matching brace, matching brace, matching brace. So it's a little bit esoteric, but I believe that it is important to have seen this and to know that it exists, especially because it is more common to do this sort of thing in languages that have manually managed memory, or that have a different style of memory management than what JavaScript has typically. Thanks for watching. If this helped you at all, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up, and subscribe and hit the bell if you want more like this. I do daily live streams on the weekdays, which is on the live stream channel in the description, and I post edited versions on the Beyond Code Bootcamp channel, also in the description. Adios.